The programmer in fatigues. Katerina Voloshin had never imagined that her computer science degree from Kiev Polytechnic would lead her to a muddy trench outside Bakhmut, huddled over a laptop powered by a car battery. The 32-year-old software engineer had traded her comfortable apartment and tech startup job for military fatigues and MREs when the invasion began. Like thousands of other Ukrainians, she had walked into a recruitment center with a simple conviction. Her country needed her, and she had skills to offer. The autumn wind carried the distant rumble of artillery as Katerina typed furiously, her fingers dancing across the keyboard despite the cold that had turned them nearly numb. Around her, soldiers from the 58th Motorized Brigade maintained their positions, occasionally glancing at the strange woman who had arrived 3 weeks ago with special authorization from command. They had nicknamed her Digital, though few understood exactly what she did during those long hours staring at screens filled with incomprehensible code. Lieutenant Mykola Kovalenko, the unit's second-in-command, approached with 2 tin cups of coffee. He was one of the few who appreciated Katerina's presence, having seen firsthand how modern warfare demanded more than just bullets and bravery. "Still working on your secret project?" he asked, offering her one of the cups. Katerina accepted gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around the warm metal. "It's not exactly secret anymore," she replied with a wry smile. "Command knows what I'm doing. They just don't officially approve of it." The issue was simple yet profound. Ukrainian forces relied heavily on commercial drones for reconnaissance, but these off-the-shelf models had critical limitations. Their control range maxed out at around 5 miles, and their encrypted signals could be jammed or intercepted by sophisticated Russian electronic warfare systems. Command had strict protocols about drone modifications, fearing that amateur attempts might compromise operational security or waste precious equipment. But Katerina had identified a solution that the military bureaucracy was too rigid to embrace quickly. By reverse engineering the drone's firmware and implementing a mesh network protocol she had developed, she could extend the effective range exponentially while making the signals nearly impossible to jam. The drones would communicate with each other, forming a relay chain that could push reconnaissance capabilities deep behind enemy lines. The problem was that her modifications violated about a dozen military regulations. She had bypassed manufacturer encryption, altered authorized equipment, and developed what technically qualified as unlicensed military communications technology. If her experiment failed, or worse, if it somehow compromised operations, she could face court-martial. Lieutenant Kovalenko understood the stakes. "You know, Captain Bonder is looking for any excuse to shut this down," he warned. "He's old school. Doesn't trust anything he can't shoot or stab." Katerina nodded, saving her latest code changes. "Then we'll have to make sure it works perfectly on the first try." "How many drones did procurement secure for me?" "4, Kovalenko replied. "And they're expecting them back in working condition, preferably without any unauthorized modifications." He made air quotes with his free hand. For it was fewer than Katerina had hoped for, but it would have to do. Her mesh network needed at least 3 nodes to function effectively, with 1 as backup. She had spent weeks writing and testing the code in simulation, but simulation could only take her so far. The real test would come when she deployed the modified drones in actual combat conditions, with electronic warfare units actively trying to disrupt Ukrainian communications. As if reading her thoughts, Kovalenko added, "Command approved a reconnaissance window for tomorrow at dawn. You'll have 2 hours during a planned artillery operation. If your system works, we'll finally have eyes on those supply routes Command has been asking about. If it doesn't," he left the consequences unspoken. Katerina took a long sip of the bitter coffee and turned back to her laptop. Tomorrow at dawn meant she had less than 12 hours to complete the firmware modifications, test them, and install them on 4 drones without breaking anything. In her previous life, she would have had a team of developers, proper testing environments, and weeks of quality assurance. Now she had a car battery, a freezing trench, and the weight of soldiers' lives, depending on her code, working flawlessly. She cracked her knuckles and began typing again. There was no room for error, no tolerance for bugs. In software development, A crash meant a frustrated user and maybe a bad review. Here, it could mean missed intelligence, failed operations, and casualties. The war had taught her that the most elegant code wasn't always the most complex. It was the code that worked when everything else failed. Midnight debugging. The makeshift command post smelled of damp earth, cigarette smoke, and the particular odor of electronics running continuously in humid conditions. Katerina had claimed a corner of the underground bunker, surrounding herself with a nest of cables, circuit boards, and 4 DJI Mavic drones in various states of disassembly. The single LED lantern cast harsh shadows that made her eyes ache, but she couldn't afford to stop. It was 0200 hours, and she had encountered a problem that made her stomach clench with anxiety. The mesh network protocol was working beautifully in isolation, each drone able to relay signals to its neighbors with minimal latency. But when she integrated it with the existing video transmission system, something was causing intermittent failures. 1 out of every 20 video packets was being dropped, creating stutters in the feed that would be unacceptable during actual reconnaissance. Come on, she muttered, scrolling through diagnostic logs. Her eyes burned from staring at the screen for hours, and her back ached from hunching over the laptop in the cramped space. She had already consumed 3 energy drinks and more coffee than was probably advisable, but sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. The source of the packet loss eluded her. It wasn't a simple coding error. She had triple-checked the protocol implementation. It wasn't hardware failure. All 4 drones showed identical symptoms. That left timing issues, buffer overflows, or some interaction with the drone's original firmware that she hadn't anticipated. Sergeant Alina Tkachenko ducked into the bunker, bringing a welcome gust of fresh air. The logistics officer had become an unlikely ally, securing equipment and running interference with skeptical commanders. "How's it going, Digital? You look like death warmed over." "I've looked better," Katerina admitted, rubbing her eyes. "I've hit a snag with the video transmission. The mesh network is working, but it's not playing nice with the camera feed." Alina pulled up an ammunition crate and sat down, studying the screens with interest despite having no technical background. "Explain it to me like I'm 5. Katerina appreciated the request. Sometimes explaining a problem in simple terms helped her see the solution. Imagine you're passing notes in class through multiple students. The notes arrive fine, but sometimes the drawings on the notes get smudged. I need to figure out why the drawings are smudging when the text is fine. Could the drawings be too big? Alina suggested. Maybe you need bigger paper? Katerina paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Bigger paper. Buffer size. Alina, you're brilliant, she said suddenly, diving back into the code. The video packets were larger than the text data packets. When the mesh network forwarded them between drones, the relay nodes might not have sufficient buffer space allocated for the larger payload size. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, modifying the buffer allocation parameters in the relay protocol. It was a simple fix, embarrassingly simple, but she had been so focused on the complex networking code that she had overlooked basic memory management. She recompiled the firmware, loaded it onto one of the test drones, and ran the simulation again. Perfect transmission. No drop packets. Yes, Katerina exclaimed, startling Alina. She ran the test 5 more times, then 10, then 20. Flawless performance each time. Relief flooded through her body, so intense it almost made her dizzy. Does that mean it's working? Alina asked hopefully. It means this particular problem is fixed, Katerina replied, the engineer in her refusing to celebrate prematurely. But I want to know if the whole system works until we test it in the field. There could be other issues I haven't anticipated. She glanced at her watch. 0330 hours. Dawn was in 3 hours, and she still needed to install the modified firmware on all 4 drones, run integration tests, and brief the pilots on the new operational parameters. The timeline was impossibly tight, but failure wasn't an option. Katerina began the process of flashing the new firmware onto each drone, a delicate operation that could brick the device if interrupted. As the first drone's status lights blinked in the upload sequence, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. In her old life, Missing a deadline meant angry clients or delayed product launches. Here, success or failure will be measured in intelligence gathered and lives potentially saved or lost. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, but it also gave her work a purpose she had never experienced in the commercial tech world. The first drone completed its update successfully. 3 to go. Alina had remained, watching the process with quiet fascination. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked softly. "You could have stayed in Kyiv, worked on cyber defense, been safe." Katerina didn't look up from the second drone's upload progress bar. "My younger brother, Dmitro, is serving with an artillery unit near Kherson. Last month, they got hit by counter-battery fire because the Russians spotted their position. 3 soldiers died." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "Dmitro survived, but he wrote to me afterward. He said if they had better reconnaissance, they might have known the Russians were tracking them." She finally looked at Alina, her eyes reflecting the LED lantern's glow. "I can't fire a rifle worth a damn, and I'd probably blow myself up trying to use a grenade launcher. But I can write code. If my code can give our units better intelligence, better situational awareness, maybe fewer brothers and sisters come home in body bags." Alina nodded slowly, understanding. So many Ukrainians had similar stories, personal reasons for fighting beyond abstract concepts of sovereignty and freedom. The war had touched every family, every community. The second drone completed its update. 2 more to go, and less than 3 hours until dawn. The first flight. Dawn broke cold and gray over the Ukrainian positions, the sun struggling to penetrate the thick clouds that promised more rain. Katerina stood in a cleared area behind the trench line, surrounded by Lieutenant Kovalenko, 2 drone pilots, and a skeptical Captain Bonder who had insisted on observing the test personally. "You have 2 hours, Voloshin," Bonder said curtly. His weathered face showed the strain of months of combat command, and his patience for experimental technology was clearly limited. "The artillery boys are hitting Russian positions near Soledar. We need reconnaissance on those supply routes, and command wants it today. If your modified drones can provide it, excellent. If not, we revert to standard procedures." "Understood, Captain," Katerina replied, keeping her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. She turned to the 2 pilots, Junior Sergeant Andriy Sokolov and Private Yulia Markov, both experienced drone operators who had been briefed on the modified system. "Remember, the interface looks the same, but the range indicators will show extended coverage. Trust the system, maintain formation spacing, and the mesh network will handle the rest." Andriy, a lanky 24-year-old who had been operating drones since the war's early days, nodded confidently. Yulia, younger and newer to the unit, looked more nervous but determined. They had both volunteered for the test flight, understanding the potential benefits if Katerina's system worked. "Launch sequence," Katerina called out, activating her monitoring laptop. On her screen, she could see telemetry feeds from all 4 drones as they powered up. Heart rate elevated, she noted clinically, as if observing someone else's stress response. The first 2 drones lifted smoothly into the gray sky, their motors whining as they climbed to operational altitude. At 500 feet, they stabilized and began moving east toward Russian-controlled territory. Katerina watched the signal strength indicators, which remained solid green, much stronger than they should have been at this distance with standard equipment. "Drone 3 and 4, launch," she instructed. These would form the relay chain, positioning themselves between the reconnaissance drones and the control station to extend the effective range. As the relay drones reached their positions, something beautiful happened on Katerina's screen. The mesh network activated automatically, the drones recognizing each other and establishing redundant communication pathways. Signal strength indicators showed multiple routes for data transmission, meaning if one drone failed or was jammed, the others would compensate. "We're at 8 miles, Andriy reported, his voice tinged with excitement. "Signal is still perfect. I've never maintained control this far out before." Captain Bonder leaned over to look at the video feeds, his skepticism beginning to crack. The camera showed increasingly clear views of Russian rear areas, territory that had been beyond reconnaissance range for weeks. 12 miles, Yulia announced. Visual confirmation of vehicle movements on the E40 highway. Counting multiple trucks, looks like a supply convoy. Katerina's heart raced as she monitored the system performance. The mesh network was functioning exactly as designed, passing data seamlessly between nodes. CPU loads were within acceptable parameters, battery consumption was only slightly higher than standard operations, and video quality remained crystal clear. 15 miles, Andriy said, his professional demeanor giving way to genuine amazement. This is incredible. We can see their entire rear logistics network. Lieutenant Kovalenko was already on the radio, reporting to command. Confirmed visual on enemy supply routes. Multiple convoys, logistics centers, and what appears to be a forward ammunition depot. Request permission to maintain observation and map enemy positions. The response came quickly. Permission granted, continue reconnaissance. For the next 90 minutes, the modified drones provided an intelligence windfall. They mapped supply routes, identified ammunition dumps, tracked troop movements, and revealed Russian defensive positions that had been invisible before. The pilots flew the drones as far as 23 miles behind enemy lines, maintaining perfect control the entire time. Captain Bonder's skepticism had evaporated entirely. He stood transfixed by the video feeds, occasionally calling out targets for the intelligence officers to log. Voloshin, he said finally, not taking his eyes off the screen, I owe you an apology. This changes everything. But Katerina barely heard the praise. She was focused on a troubling indicator on her screen. Drone 3, one of the relay nodes, was showing elevated CPU temperature. Not critical yet, but climbing steadily. The extended operation was pushing the hardware harder than she had anticipated. We need to start bringing them back, she said urgently. Drone 3 is running hot. We risk hardware failure if we push it much longer. Andriy and Yulia immediately began the return protocol, turning the reconnaissance drones around and bringing them back through the relay chain. As they retreated westward, the temperature on Drone 3 began to stabilize, then slowly decrease. 25 minutes later, all 4 drones landed safely on Ukrainian soil, their cameras having captured over 300 gigabytes of intelligence data. The pilots were grinning. Captain Bonder was already on the radio with senior command, and Lieutenant Kovalenko was shaking Katerina's hand enthusiastically. But Katerina's mind was already racing ahead to the next challenge. The system worked better than she had dared hope. But that overheating issue was a problem. Extended operations would require better thermal management, possibly hardware modifications in addition to her software improvements. Still, as she watched the intelligence officers begin analyzing the captured footage, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Her forbidden code had just given the 58th Motorized Brigade eyes 20 miles behind Russian lines. Now she had to figure out how to make it sustainable for long-term operations. The real work, she realized, was just beginning. Word spreads. Within 48 hours of the successful reconnaissance mission, Katerina's modified drone system became the worst-kept secret in the Ukrainian military. Word spread through the informal networks that connected units across the front, carried by supply truck drivers, communications officers, and the encrypted messaging groups that soldiers used to share tactical innovations. Lieutenant Colonel Petrov arrived at the 58th's position 3 days after the first flight, accompanied by 2 signals intelligence officers and a stern-looking woman from military legal services. Katerina had been expecting this visit, though not quite so soon or with such formal accompaniment. Senior Private Voloshin, Petrov began, his tone carefully neutral. I understand you have been conducting unauthorized modifications to military equipment. Katerina stood at attention, her stomach knotting with anxiety. Yes, sir. I modified the firmware on 4 reconnaissance drones to extend their operational range and improve their resistance to electronic warfare. Modifications that violated regulations regarding equipment tampering, communication security protocols, and field authorization procedures. The legal officer interjected, consulting a tablet, any one of which could result in disciplinary action up to and including court-martial. The silence that followed was heavy. Captain Bonder stepped forward, his expression grim. With respect, ma'am, Senior Private Voloshin's modifications provided intelligence that has already resulted in 3 successful artillery strikes on Russian logistics targets. Battalion Command estimates we eliminated approximately 40 enemy vehicles and disrupted supply operations for at least a week. One of the signals intelligence officers, a major whose name tape read Kravchenko, cleared his throat. We've analyzed the technical specifications of Private Voloshin's mesh network protocol. It's actually quite sophisticated. The encryption implementation is arguably more secure than our standard systems, and the jamming resistance is remarkable. Petrov held up a hand, silencing the discussion. He studied Katerina for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Private Voloshin, do you understand why we have regulations about equipment modifications? Yes, sir, Katerina replied. To prevent operational compromises, ensure interoperability between units, maintain security protocols, and avoid wasting resources on untested systems that might fail in the field. Correct. And yet you proceeded anyway. Katerina met his gaze steadily. Sir, with respect, the bureaucratic process for approval would have taken months or possibly years. Our soldiers needed better reconnaissance capabilities now. I believe the potential benefits outweighed the risks, especially since I tested extensively before field deployment. Petrov's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, perhaps respect. Major Kravchenko, how long would formal approval for such a system modification take through standard channels? Realistically, sir, 4 to 6 months for technical review, another 3 months for security assessment, and then procurement approval, Kravchenko admitted. Assuming no delays, which is unlikely. So 9 months minimum, Petrov said. Private Voloshin, how long did your development take? 3 weeks of code development, sir, and another week of testing before the first operational deployment. The lieutenant colonel nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. Here's what's going to happen. Officially, Private Voloshin will receive a written reprimand for unauthorized equipment modification, which will be placed in her service record. Unofficially, she will be temporarily assigned to Major Kravchenko's Signals Intelligence Unit with the rank of Senior Sergeant and tasked with documenting her modifications, training other personnel on the system's use, and potentially developing additional improvements. He turned to the legal officer. Does that satisfy the regulatory requirements? The woman's expression suggested she found the solution less than ideal, but she nodded. It addresses the violation while preserving operational capabilities. I'll draft the appropriate documentation. Katerina felt dizzy with relief. Not only was she avoiding serious punishment, but she was being given official support to continue her work. Thank you, sir. I won't disappoint you. See that you don't, Petrov replied. Because 6 other units have already requested deployments of your system. Within a month, I expect we'll have demand from 20 or more. You're about to become very busy, Senior Sergeant Voloshin. After the officers departed, Lieutenant Kovalenko found Katerina sitting on an empty ammunition crate, staring at nothing in particular. Congratulations on the promotion, he said, sitting beside her, and on not getting court-martialed. I honestly wasn't sure which way that was going to go, Katerina admitted. For a moment there, I thought I was done. Command isn't stupid, Kovalenko replied. They recognize value when they see it, even if it comes wrapped in broken regulations. You've given us a significant tactical advantage. The Russians won't have a counter for months, maybe longer. Katerina nodded, but her mind was already moving ahead to the challenges. 6 units want the system. That means I need to modify at least 24 drones, possibly more if we want redundancy. And I need to write proper documentation, create training materials, and probably develop a streamlined installation process because I can't personally flash firmware on every drone in the Ukrainian military. You'll need help, Kovalenko observed. You can't scale this up alone. I know. I'm hoping Major Kravchenko's unit has some competent programmers I can work with. And we'll need to address that overheating issue I observed during the first flight. Plus, I'm thinking about version 2 of the protocol, maybe adding autonomous waypoint relay stations and encrypted data caching for operations in areas with heavy jamming. Kovalenko laughed and shook his head. Most people would be celebrating right now. You're already planning the next upgrade. Katerina smiled, a tired but genuine expression. In software development, version 1 is never the final version. There's always room for improvement, always another feature to add or bug to fix, especially when people's lives depend on your code working flawlessly. She looked out across the defensive positions, where soldiers maintained their vigilance against an enemy that lay beyond the horizon. Somewhere out there, possibly within range of her modified drones right now, Russian forces were planning their next move. And thanks to the system she had created, Ukrainian commanders would have better intelligence about those plans. It was a good feeling, she decided. The best feeling she had experienced since the war began. But Kovalenko was right about one thing. She couldn't do this alone anymore. The system needed to scale, and that meant building a team, establishing proper procedures, and transforming her ad hoc invention into a reliable, reproducible capability. The challenge excited and intimidated her in equal measure. I should get started on the documentation, she said, standing up. Those 6 units aren't going to train themselves. As she walked back toward the command post, her mind was already organizing tasks, prioritizing features, and planning the infrastructure needed to support widespread deployment. The programmer in her was fully engaged now, seeing not just code but systems, processes, and solutions. The war had taken so much from Ukraine, but it had also revealed extraordinary capacities for innovation and adaptation. Katerina was determined to prove that Ukrainian ingenuity could match Russian firepower, one line of code at a time. Building the team. Major Kravchenko's Signals Intelligence Unit operated from a former schoolhouse in a town 15 kilometers behind the front lines. The building's basement had been converted into a technology center, filled with servers, communications equipment, and enough cable to outfit a small telecommunications company. It was here that Katerina reported for her new assignment, carrying her laptop and a drive containing all her development work. The major was waiting for her in what had once been the school's computer lab, now repurposed as a software development workspace. "Welcome to the Digital Warfare Development Center," he said with a slight smile. "That's what we're calling it unofficially. Officially, with a 104th Signals Support Detachment, which sounds much less interesting. Thank you for advocating for me, with Lieutenant Colonel Petrov, sir," Katerina said. Kravchenko waved off the thanks. "I didn't do it for you. I did it because we desperately need people with your skills. The Russians are treating this war as a testing ground for cyber and electronic warfare systems. We need to innovate just to keep pace, let alone get ahead." He gestured to 3 individuals sitting at various workstations. "Let me introduce your new team. This is Lieutenant Vasil Boyko, formerly a network security specialist at Kyivstar. Captain Irina Marchenko worked for Microsoft before the war, specializing in distributed systems. And Staff Sergeant Taras Shevchuk was our military's lead developer for the encrypted communications app before it got nationalized." Katerina nodded to each of them, assessing her new colleagues. They looked as exhausted as she felt, probably pulled from their previous assignments with little warning. But their eyes showed keen intelligence and, more importantly, genuine interest in the technical challenge ahead. "I've briefed them on your mesh network system," Kravchenko continued. "They've all reviewed your code and have questions. Lots of questions. I'll leave you to it. I need a brief command on our deployment timeline." He paused at the door. "They're expecting functional systems for 6 units within 3 weeks. I told them 4 weeks was realistic. Prove me right, and don't let the bastards sleep too much." After he left, an awkward silence settled over the room. Katerina was technically the senior sergeant now, but she was the newest member of this team and significantly less experienced with military operations than the others. Breaking the ice would be critical. "So," she began, "who wants to tell me everything I did wrong in my code?" Vasil laughed, breaking the tension. "I wouldn't say wrong exactly, but there are some interesting design choices. The encryption implementation, for example, is very clever, but it's also computationally expensive. Have you considered using hardware acceleration if we can modify the drone's processors? I haven't, Katarina admitted, because I was working with stock hardware and couldn't modify the physical components. But if we have access to drones we can actually modify, yes, hardware acceleration would significantly improve performance. Irina leaned forward, her laptop screen showing a diagram of the mesh network protocol. The autonomous relay formation is brilliant, but it's also a single point of failure in one sense. If the drones lose line of sight with each other, the whole network collapses. Have you thought about implementing a store and forward capability for when relay links are temporarily interrupted? I've thought about it, Katarina replied, warming to the technical discussion, but I worried about data security. If drones are caching intelligence data locally and one gets shot down or captured, we could be handing the Russians our reconnaissance information. Encrypt the cache data with time-limited keys, Taras suggested. He had been quiet until now, but his suggestion was solid. The drones only cache data temporarily, and the encryption keys expire after, say, 30 minutes. Even if the Russians recover a drone, the cache data is useless by the time they crack it. Katarina nodded slowly, considering the implications. That could work. It would make the system much more resilient to jamming and temporary signal loss. But it increases complexity, which means more potential bugs and more testing required. Everything's a trade-off, Irina said philosophically. More capability versus more complexity. Welcome to systems engineering in wartime. They spent the next 6 hours diving deep into the technical details, dissecting every aspect of Katarina's implementation. It was the most intellectually stimulating conversation she had experienced in months, a return to the collaborative problem-solving that she had loved about software development before the war. By evening, they had developed a comprehensive plan. Vassal would handle the encryption optimization and work on hardware acceleration options. Irina would implement the store and forward capability and improve the mesh network's resilience. Taras would develop the installation and configuration tools to streamline deployment. Katarina would serve as technical lead, coordinating the efforts and handling the critical path items that required her specific expertise. We need a proper version control system, Vassal observed. Can't have 4 people editing code without proper source control. I'll set up a Git server on our internal network tonight. And we need a testing protocol, Irina added. Proper CI/CD, automated testing, the works. We can't risk deploying buggy code to operational units. Katarina felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. For weeks, she had been working alone, carrying the entire burden of development, testing, and deployment. Now she had a team, competent people who understood both the technical challenges and the operational urgency. There's one more thing, Taras said quietly. We should discuss version control, not just for code, but for intelligence. Your system is going to generate massive amounts of reconnaissance data. We need a proper database and analysis framework, or commands will drown in raw footage without being able to extract actionable intelligence. The comment stopped everyone. He was absolutely right. Katarina had been so focused on extending the drone's range and capabilities that she had given insufficient thought to what happened to all the data they collected. That's beyond our scope, isn't it? Vassal asked. Intelligence analysis is a different department. But we're the ones creating the data flood, Katarina countered. We have a responsibility to make it usable. Taras, can you liaison with intelligence units and see what tools they need? Maybe we can build something to automatically flag suspicious activities or identify high-priority targets. AI-assisted intelligence analysis, Irina said, a note of excitement in her voice. Machine learning models trained to recognize military vehicles, identify pattern changes, maybe even predict enemy movements based on logistical flows. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Katarina cautioned, though she was intrigued by the possibilities. First priority is getting the core system deployed to those 6 units. But yes, we should be thinking about the next phase. Everything we build should be designed with future enhancements in mind. They worked until nearly midnight, planning sprints, dividing tasks, and establishing communication protocols. When Major Kravchenko finally ordered them to get some sleep, They had a solid development roadmap that felt actually achievable. As Katerina lay on her cot in the makeshift quarters, she reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. She had gone from a lone programmer breaking rules in a trench to the technical lead of an official military software development team. The responsibility was daunting, but for the first time since beginning this project, she felt like success was truly possible. Tomorrow, they would begin the real work, transforming her prototype into a production system that could serve Ukrainian forces across multiple front lines. But tonight, she allowed herself to feel hopeful. First contact with the enemy. The message arrived via encrypted military channels at 0430 hours, jolting Katerina awake despite her exhaustion. Russian electronic warfare units had detected the modified drone signals during operations near Bakhmut and were actively attempting to analyze and counter them. Intelligence suggested they were deploying specialized jamming equipment specifically designed to disrupt the mesh network protocol. "They've noticed us," Major Kravchenko said grimly when the team assembled 30 minutes later in the operations center. "Faster than we expected, honestly. Our signals intelligence intercepts indicate they're prioritizing this as a significant threat. We should take that as a compliment, but it also means we're in a race." Captain Marchenko pulled up a map showing the electronic warfare activity. Red zones marked areas where Russian jamming had been detected, overlapping uncomfortably with Ukrainian positions that were using the modified drone systems. They're using directional jammers, very sophisticated ones. They can't crack our encryption yet, but they're trying to overwhelm the mesh network by flooding all frequencies simultaneously. "Does it work?" Taras asked, the question everyone was thinking. "Partially," Irina admitted. "We're seeing increased latency in those zones and occasional drop connections. The mesh network is resilient, but it's not invulnerable. If they get much more aggressive with the jamming, we could lose effectiveness." Katerina felt her stomach tighten. She had known this moment would come eventually, the inevitable countermove in the technological chess game between Ukrainian and Russian forces. But she had hoped for more time before facing sophisticated opposition. "We need to implement frequency hopping," Vassal said immediately. "Make the drones change frequencies unpredictably. The jammers can't disrupt what they can't predict." "Already started," Katerina replied, pulling up code on her laptop. "I began working on it last week when we first deployed to multiple units. The problem is that frequency hopping requires the entire mesh network to coordinate its frequency changes perfectly. If one drone is out of sync, the whole network breaks down." "Network time protocol synchronization," Irina suggested. "The drones share precise timing information as part of the mesh protocol. We can use that to coordinate frequency hops down to the millisecond." "Military-grade frequency hopping typically uses pseudo-random sequences," Taras added. "But those can potentially be predicted if the Russians capture a drone and extract the seed values. We should use cryptographically secure random number generation for the frequency selection." Major Kravchenko listened to the technical discussion with the patience of a commander who understood he was out of his depth. "In plain language, can we counter their jamming, and how long will it take?" Katerina considered carefully. "Yes, we can counter it. The frequency hopping implementation will take approximately 1 week to develop, test, and deploy. But that assumes they don't change their tactics in the meantime. This is going to be an ongoing battle, Major. We develop a counter, they develop a counter to our counter, and so on. So we're in an arms race," Kravchenko observed. "We've always been in an arms race," Katerina replied. "This is just the electronic warfare version. The advantage we have is agility. We could develop and deploy updates in days or weeks. They have to go through their bureaucratic military-industrial complex, which takes months. If we stay innovative and move fast, we can stay ahead of them." A new message arrived, this one from one of the units using the drone system. Katerina read it and felt ice in her veins. "One of our drones was shot down near Soldar. The wreckage was recovered by Russian forces." The room fell silent. A captured drone meant the Russians would have access to the modified hardware and firmware. They could reverse engineer the mesh network protocol study the encryption implementation, and potentially develop far more effective countermeasures. How bad is this? Kravchenko asked. It depends on what they can extract from the wreckage, Vasil said. If the drone's memory is damaged, they might not get much. But if it's intact, they'll have everything, Katerina finished. The encryption keys, the mesh protocol specification, the frequency plans. They'll know exactly how our system works. So we change everything, Irina said decisively. New encryption keys, modified protocol, different frequency allocation. We treat the current implementation as compromised and move to version 2 immediately. That's hundreds of hours of work, Tara's protested. And we'd have to update every deployed drone simultaneously, or units running different versions won't be able to communicate with each other. Katerina was already thinking through the implications, her mind racing through the technical challenges. Not if we implement a dual protocol system. The drones run both the old and new versions simultaneously for a transition period. They try the new protocol first, fall back to the old one if they detect an older drone, then gradually phase out the old version as all units update. That's actually ingenious, Vasil said with reluctant admiration. Complicated as hell to implement, but it solves the coordination problem. It also gives us a framework for future updates, Irina added, warming to the idea. We can continuously evolve the system without requiring coordinated fleet-wide updates. Major Kravchenko held up a hand. I need a straight answer. Can we stay ahead of Russian countermeasures, or are we fighting a losing battle? Katerina met his gaze steadily. We can stay ahead, sir, but it requires constant development, rapid deployment of updates, and accepting that some of our drones will be lost or captured. This isn't a static system we can deploy and forget. It's a living, evolving capability that requires ongoing maintenance and improvement. How many people would you need to sustain that level of development? At least double our current team, Katerina said. Maybe triple if we want to stay really ahead of the curve. And we need better testing infrastructure, faster deployment pipelines, and direct communication channels with operational units, so we can respond quickly to emerging threats. Kravchenko nodded slowly, processing the requirements. I'll talk to command about resources. In the meantime, get started on the frequency hopping implementation and the protocol update. Consider the current system as having a limited lifespan. Plan accordingly. After he left, the team sat in heavy silence. The excitement of their earlier success had been tempered by the harsh reality of technical warfare. Every advancement would be met with a counter-advancement. Every victory would be temporary. So we're officially in a cyber war arms race with the Russian military, Taras observed dryly. This should be interesting. Interesting is one word for it, Vasil replied. Terrifying is another. Katerina started typing, already sketching out the architecture for the frequency hopping implementation. Then we better make sure we're the scary ones, she said. They're expecting us to slow down, to be defensive. Instead, we're going to accelerate. More features, more capabilities, more innovation. We'll move so fast they can't keep up. She looked around at her team, seeing determination replacing initial worry. They were all in this together now, bound by shared purpose and mutual reliance. The Russians had just raised the stakes, but that didn't mean the Ukrainians were going to back down. If anything, it meant they needed to push harder. 48-hour sprint. The basement of the schoolhouse transformed into something resembling a Silicon Valley startup during a critical product launch, except the motivations were life or death rather than market share. Energy drinks and coffee became the primary sustenance. Sleep became optional. Every wall was covered with white boards showing code snippets, network diagrams, and task lists marked with color markers indicating priority levels. Katerina had divided the team into 2 parallel development tracks. She and Vasil worked on the frequency hopping implementation, while Irina and Taras developed the dual protocol framework. The goal was impossibly ambitious. Deploy a fully tested update to all operational units within 48 hours. This is insane, Vasil muttered at hour 16, his eyes bloodshot from staring at code. We're developing in 2 days what should take 2 months. The Russians aren't going to give us 2 months, Katerina replied, not looking up from her screen. She was implementing the cryptographically secure random number generator that would drive the frequency hopping sequence. The mathematics were elegant but unforgiving. A single error would cause the entire mesh network to desynchronize and collapse. In the corner, Irina was cursing at her laptop in a creative mixture of Ukrainian and English. The backward compatibility layer is eating up half the processing power. These drones weren't designed for this level of computational complexity. Can we optimize? Tara's asked, moving to look over her shoulder. I've been optimizing for 3 hours, Irina snapped, then immediately apologized. Sorry, tired. Yes, there's probably more optimization possible, but every micro-optimization takes time we don't have. Katerina made a decision. Strip out the video compression enhancement from version 2. It's nice to have, but not critical. The processing power saved can go to the protocol compatibility layer. That's one of our best features, Vassal protested. And it will still be a great feature in version 3, Katerina replied firmly. Right now, we need reliability and compatibility over fancy features. We can add complexity later once the foundation is solid. At hour 24, Major Kravchenko descended into the basement, carrying a tray of sandwiches and actual fruit, luxuries rarely seen near the front lines. Status report, he requested, distributing the food. Frequency hopping implementation is functionally complete, Katerina said, gratefully accepting an apple. We're in testing phase. Initial results are promising, but we found 3 edge cases where the synchronization breaks down. The dual protocol system works, Irina added, but it's slower than we hoped. We're looking at about 15% performance degradation during the transition period. Is 15% degradation acceptable? Kravchenko asked. Better than 0% functionality, which is what we'll have if the Russians jam our current system, Taras said pragmatically. Once all units update and we can deprecate the old protocol, performance actually improves beyond the original version. Kravchenko nodded, chewing thoughtfully. Intelligence reports the Russians are deploying more jamming equipment. We've lost effective reconnaissance capability in 2 sectors already. Whatever you're building, we need it soon. The pressure was crushing, but it also clarified priorities wonderfully. Katerina eliminated another 3 non-critical features from the update, focusing ruthlessly on the core capabilities: frequency hopping, protocol compatibility, and the encryption improvements that Vassal had been advocating for. At hour 36, disaster struck. During integration testing, the frequency hopping system caused 3 test drones to crash. They had all simultaneously switched to the same frequency at the same moment, creating catastrophic interference that overwhelmed their receivers and sent them spiraling into the ground. How was that even possible? Vassal demanded, reviewing the crash logs. The frequency selection algorithm is supposed to ensure diversity. This shouldn't happen. Katerina was already digging through the code, her exhausted mind struggling to see the pattern. There, buried in the randomization seed generation, a subtle flaw in how the cryptographic random number generator was initialized. Under specific timing conditions, multiple drones could end up with correlated random sequences. Found it, she announced, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. The RNG initialization uses the network timestamp, but if multiple drones boot up simultaneously, they can get identical seed values. It's a classic PRNG collision problem. How do we fix it? Irina asked. Add the drone's unique hardware ID to the seed value, Katerina said, already implementing the fix. That ensures each drone has a truly unique random sequence regardless of timing. The fix took 20 minutes to implement, an hour to test, and proved completely effective. The drones now hopped frequencies in beautifully uncorrelated patterns, impossible for jammers to predict or follow. At hour 45, with 3 hours remaining before their self-imposed deadline, they had a working system. Not perfect, not fully optimized, but functional and tested enough to deploy with reasonable confidence. We need to start the update rollout, Major Kravchenko said, reviewing the final test results. Every hour we delay, the Russians get more effective at jamming our current systems. Katarina wanted to test more, to find and fix the bugs she knew must still be lurking in the code. But the Major was right. Perfect was the enemy of good enough, and soldiers needed this capability now. Begin deployment, she authorized. Start with the units experiencing the most jamming, then roll out to others. Monitor all telemetry closely and be ready to roll back if we see critical failures. The next 3 hours were agonizing. They watched remote telemetry feeds as drones across multiple frontline units updated to the new firmware. Each update carried the risk of bricking a valuable drone or, worse, degrading capabilities during a critical mission. But one by one, the updates completed successfully. Drones that had been struggling against Russian jamming suddenly regained clear communications. Reconnaissance missions that had been impossible for days became viable again. The frequency hopping worked exactly as designed, hopping unpredictably across the spectrum faster than any jammer could track. At hour 48, Katarina received confirmation that all deployed units had successfully updated. More importantly, field reports indicated the new system was performing better than the original under jamming conditions. The Russians' countermeasures had been effectively neutralized. She allowed herself to slump in her chair, sudden exhaustion crushing down on her. Vasil had already fallen asleep at his keyboard. Irina was crying quietly, whether from relief or exhaustion or both. Katarina couldn't tell. Taras sat staring at the success metrics on his screen, a dazed smile on his face. "You did it," Major Kravchenko said simply. 48 hours from crisis to deployment. "I've never seen anything like it." "We did it," Katarina corrected. "The team. We all did it." But she knew the celebration would be brief. The Russians would analyze the new system, develop new countermeasures, and the cycle would continue. This was just one battle in an ongoing technological war. Still, for this moment, they had won. Ukrainian forces had their eyes back, seeing deep behind enemy lines despite the Russians' best efforts to blind them. It would have to be enough, at least until the next crisis. The legacy. 3 months after the 48-hour sprint, Katarina stood in a briefing room in Kyiv, far from the front lines, but still very much in the war. Around the table sat senior officers, government officials, and representatives from allied nations interested in Ukraine's innovations in military technology. The drone system she had hacked together in a frozen trench had evolved into something far larger. 23 units across multiple fronts now use variations of the mesh network protocol. The team had grown to 15 software engineers, working in shifts to provide 24-hour development support. They had deployed 6 major updates and dozens of minor patches, staying ahead of Russian countermeasures through constant innovation. The system you're about to see represents a fundamental shift in tactical reconnaissance capabilities. Major Kravchenko began, now promoted to lieutenant colonel, and serving as the official spokesman for the program. But what makes it truly remarkable isn't the technology itself. It's how it was developed. He clicked to a slide showing the timeline. From Katarina's initial prototype to the current production system, the whole development spanning less than 5 months. In conventional military procurement terms, they were still years away from initial requirements gathering. Senior Lieutenant Voloshin, Kravchenko said, gesturing to Katarina. She had been promoted again, the military recognizing her contributions and leadership. "Would you walk us through the technical capabilities?" Katarina stepped to the front, calling up a live demonstration feed. On the screen, 4 drones flew in coordinated formation somewhere over eastern Ukraine, their cameras revealing Russian positions with crystal clarity. The video stream remained stable despite heavy electronic warfare activity visible in the telemetry data. The current system provides reliable reconnaissance up to 35 miles behind enemy lines, she explained, with resistance to jamming, interception, and signal analysis. The mesh network creates redundant communication pathways, so losing individual drones doesn't compromise the mission. And our continuous update framework means we can deploy improvements or countermeasures in hours rather than months. An American colonel leaned forward with interest. "What's your development methodology? How do you iterate this quickly?" "We borrowed heavily from agile software development practices," Katarina replied. "Small team, rapid sprints, continuous integration, and testing. But we also established direct feedback loops with operational units. Pilots and intelligence officers can report issues or request features directly to the development team. We prioritize based on operational impact, not bureaucratic procedure. In security review, a Ukrainian cybersecurity official asked pointedly, "How do you ensure these rapid updates don't introduce vulnerabilities?" "We have automated security testing as part of the deployment pipeline," Vasil answered from his seat. He had joined Katerina in Kyiv for the briefing. Every code change is scanned for common vulnerabilities. Encryption implementations are verified against known attack vectors, and we maintain a red team that actively tries to break our systems. It's not perfect, but it's more rigorous than it sounds. A British intelligence officer spoke up. "We've been tracking your technological evolution with interest. The Russians have dedicated significant resources to countering your systems, yet you continue to maintain operational effectiveness. How sustainable is this arms race?" Katerina considered the question carefully. "As long as we maintain technical agility and willingness to innovate, we can stay ahead. The moment we become complacent or rigid, we lose. That's true in software development, and it's proving true in military technology as well." She clicked to a slide showing the team's expansion plans. "We're establishing a formal military software development school, training more engineers in rapid deployment methodologies. We're also documenting our innovations so other units can adapt them. The goal isn't to create a monopoly on good ideas. It's to create a culture of innovation throughout the military." After the formal briefing ended, Katerina found herself in a smaller conference room with Lieutenant Colonel Kravchenko and a few senior planners discussing next steps. The drone system had been successful beyond anyone's expectations, but success brought new challenges. "We've had requests from artillery units, logistics commands, even medical evacuation teams," Kravchenko said. "Everyone wants custom software solutions developed with your team's methodology. We need to figure out how to scale without losing what makes the approach effective." "Decentralize," Katerina suggested. "Train multiple small teams rather than trying to build one massive organization. Give them the tools, methodologies, and support structure, then let them innovate independently. Some will fail, but the ones that succeed will create capabilities we haven't even imagined yet." "You're describing a complete restructuring of how the military approaches technology development," one of the planners observed. "Yes," Katerina agreed simply. "The old model doesn't work for modern warfare. Technology evolves too quickly, and the battlefield demands are too immediate. Either we adapt, or we cede the technological advantage to whoever adapts faster." Later, Katerina stood on the roof of the building, looking out over Kyiv's skyline. The city bore scars from missile strikes, but life continued with remarkable resilience. Below, people went about their lives, working, shopping, living. Her phone buzzed with a message from her brother Dmitro. "Heard you briefed some generals today. Look at you, big shot. Seriously, though, your toys saved our asses again last week. Artillery spotted Russian movement we never would have seen. Keep doing what you're doing." Katerina smiled, tucking the phone away. That was what mattered, ultimately. Not the briefings, or the promotions, or the recognition. It was knowing that the code she wrote, the systems her team built, made a tangible difference for soldiers like Dmitro. Vasil joined her on the roof, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thinking deep thoughts. Thinking about how much has changed," Katerina replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "5 months ago, I was a civilian programmer who had never written a line of military software. Now I'm briefing allied military officials on electronic warfare tactics. The war changes people," Vasil observed, "usually for the worse. But sometimes it reveals capabilities we never knew we had." "I keep wondering what happens after," Katerina said quietly. "When the war ends, whenever that is, do I go back to building commercial apps? Can I even do that anymore? Knowing how to build systems that save lives?" "You're assuming we'll ever stop," Vasil said with a slight smile. "The Russians might stop shooting eventually, but the technological competition won't end. Someone will always need people who can build secure, resilient systems under pressure. Maybe that's the defense industry. Maybe it's civilian infrastructure. Maybe it's something we haven't thought of yet. Katerina nodded thoughtfully. He was probably right. The skills they had developed, the methodologies they had refined, would have applications long after this particular war ended. But that was a concern for the future. For now, there was work to do. The mesh network protocol needed another update to counter the latest Russian jamming techniques. The training program for new developer teams required curriculum development. And somewhere on the front lines, soldiers were relying on systems she had helped create to survive and succeed. She finished her coffee and turned back toward the door. Come on. The version 4 specifications aren't going to write themselves. As they descended back into the building, Katerina reflected on the strange path that had brought her here. A civilian programmer who became a soldier, who became a technical leader, who helped transform how the Ukrainian military approached technology. Her forbidden drone code, developed in violation of regulations and military procedure, had given Ukrainian forces a critical advantage. But more than that, it had demonstrated a new model for military innovation. Small teams, rapid development, constant iteration, and willingness to break rules when necessary. The Russians would eventually develop counters. They always did. But by then, Katerina and teams like hers would have moved on to the next innovation, staying one step ahead in the endless technological dance of modern warfare. It wasn't the life she had planned, but as she returned to her workstation, pulling up the code editor and preparing for another sprint, she realized it was exactly the life she was meant to live. The war had taken much from Ukraine, but it had also revealed the extraordinary capacity of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when their country needed them. One line of code at a time.